Even while the Williamsons were moving into their new home at the edge of the woods, they had no idea that they were being watched from the woods. After they moved in, they continued to be watched from those woods, and eventually, from right outside of their windows. And whoever was watching them left this trail, one that led straight back to a dilapidated old cabin. Inside of the cabin was a room with giant shackles that were so big they weren't made for any human. This strange, yet true story happened in London, Ohio. And if you know anything about London, Ohio, well, then you know that it's the kind of place where time never seems to be in a hurry. It's a small rural town surrounded by open fields, railroad tracks, and pockets of densely packed old forest. It's the type of place where everyone knows everyone else. They wave from porches, they trade stories at the market, and they raise their families in peace. For Diane and Keith Williams, high school sweethearts who married young, it was the only world that they'd ever known. Well, after several years of marriage, and with their 4-year-old daughter, Raven, growing up fast, they decided that it was time to get a new place. Something on the outskirts of town, maybe. Keith had grown up hunting, and a place not too far from the woods would be ideal. Well, that's when Diane found it. This small home on the edge of town, setting with the backyard right up against a thick wall of trees that stretched all the way to the old railroad line. It was peaceful, affordable, secluded. It was perfect. Well, they moved in 1981, full of optimism. Keith worked long days as a welder, and then he spent his evenings attending trade school at night, leaving Diane and Raven home alone. But there was no reason to worry. This was a safe area. Families had lived in and around this area for generations. But, and you knew there was a but coming, didn't you? Almost immediately, odd things began to grab their attention. For example, behind their home, there was this small utility shed. It's one of those inexpensive structures that one gets from a hardware store and then assembles it at home. Well, a few days after they moved in, Keith went out to inspect it for hornets and other dangerous critters that might be making it their home before allowing Raven to play nearby. As he was checking the siding, he saw this large handprint near the top of the shed, far higher than most people would be able to reach. Well, he paused, and as he was puzzling over this, something inside of him tensed up. Maybe much the same way that it does inside of you when you suddenly realize that you're not alone. Keith had grown up hunting in the woods not too far from these. He understood the subtle signs, the shift in the air, the prickling along the back of one's neck. It was unmistakable. Someone was watching him. So he slowly scanned the tree line, but nothing stood out. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that a presence was hovering just beyond his view. Well, after a few more minutes, not seeing anyone, and finding the shed safe enough for Raven to play nearby, he shrugged it off, and he went back inside. Then a few days later, Diane heard this loud banging coming from the back of the house. It sounded as if someone had slammed something very heavy into the siding. Well, it was so startling that she called the police, who arrived quickly. They looked around the yard, and they discovered that a trash can was most likely the culprit. Probably blown by the wind, they said, or maybe a raccoon or something else threw it. They really didn't have any answers. In any case, nothing to worry about, ma'am. All was fine. But later, Keith went out and he saw that whatever struck the siding did so high up. Well, he looked at the wind-blown trash can idea. It would had to have been blown pretty hard. No, the wind didn't do that. And a raccoon? Raccoon. Come on. Well, he didn't say anything to Diane, not wanting to worry her, but he knew that something wasn't right. Still, nothing could have prepared them for what happened next.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, my husband tells the stories, and after this video, you should go to our online store and check out this Veilwalker shirt. It's pretty amazing.
One night, while Diane was tucking Raven into bed, Raven raised her hand up and she made it look like it was talking, kind of like this. I used to put little faces on my hand. Anyway, then she made this strange growling sound, and it was different. And her mother said, "Oh, wow, sweetie, what's that?" But Raven didn't respond. She just kind of tensed up. So her mother asked, "Honey, where did you hear that?" And then Raven looked somberly at the window, and she said, "Over there." And she did so in a fashion that gave Diane chills. The moment was unnerving, as neither of them spoke. But then, after a moment, Diane, not wanting to frighten her child, pushed the feeling aside. She pulled the covers up around Raven and then kissed her goodnight. Personally, I would have went right outside of Raven's window that very moment, but Diane instead told herself that children imagine all sorts of things. Well, in any case, this did cause her senses to be heightened, on alert. From that day forward, she seemed to hear every little sound that the house made as it settled. Most of them were nothing, but before long, she began to hear sounds that weren't the house settling. It was vague at first, but soon she was sure of it. Scampering sounds all around the exterior of the home. And not the type of scampering that comes from a small animal either. No, this was from something larger. Not exactly footsteps either. Something quicker, lighter, circling the house at unpredictable intervals. Well, she found herself often glancing out of the kitchen window over the sink toward the forest, hoping that she might catch a deer, a stray dog, or anything normal.
I'm not a nervy person. I've lived out in the country all my life. But this was not right. Something was out there, stalking me.
Diane saw something that made her stumble backwards. Her breath was taken out of her. Out there in the darkness, not at all that far from her window, were two glowing yellow eyes, peering back at her, seemingly deliberately. Well, the eyes must belong to some type of an animal, right? Even as she was forcing that thought into her brain, she knew that it wasn't right. No, these eyes were way too far above the ground to belong to any animal. And the amber glow? Well, that was off too. Different. Definitely not the eye shine of a deer. These were large, round, reflective. These eyes were positioned just about human eye level. The truth was unmistakable. Someone was outside, standing in her yard, watching her as she moved through her house. And who knows for how long. Well, she scrambled away from the window. She crawled backward into the living room. And as she did, she heard a car pull up in the driveway. Keith was home. Thank God. So she ran out and told him what she saw. But Keith did what I suspect many husbands would do. He assured her that everything was okay, and it really was probably nothing more than just new house jitters. They had just moved here, and she was home alone many nights while he was at school. But, being a good husband, he told her that he would go out and check the yard. So he grabbed his flashlight, and out he went. First, he walked that area in the yard where she said that she saw the eyes. And as far as he could tell, the ground was undisturbed. It didn't reveal any signs that somebody had just been standing there. So he walked all the way around the house, shining the light as he went, looking for anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing he could see, anywhere around the house, anywhere around the porch, anywhere out into the woods behind them. Nothing but empty lawn, and then, of course, thick darkness. No prints, no disturbances, no strange man, no creature. Well, he reassured her the best that he could. There is nothing out there. But Diane, well, she wasn't reassured. She knew what she saw, and soon she would see it again. But this time, it would be much, much closer. Over the next several weeks, Diane just couldn't shake the feeling. You know, the feeling that she were being watched constantly. Someone was out there. She just knew it. Well, she kept the curtains closed, She walked softly after dark, as she did her very best to avoid looking out of the windows altogether. But sometimes the feeling would get the best of her, and she just couldn't help herself, and she would have to peek. But to her relief, there was never anyone there. Well, that is, until one night. She had just put Raven to bed and then walked into the living room when she once again heard movement outside. Something was shifting in the darkness, weaving between the bare winter trees. So she got real quiet, and then she turned off all of the lights, hoping that the darkness would help her to see more clearly. And it did. It was terrifying, really. A figure there right outside of the window, just inches from the glass. It was tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving, stationary, just staring into the house, staring directly at her with those two glowing eyes. Of course, for an instant, she was completely paralyzed with fear. All she could do was stare back. She couldn't even breathe. As she stood there looking at it, she really couldn't make out the face, only the shape. Whoever this was, he was large, muscular. Well, after a moment, her senses returned, and she was able to duck back toward the wall, trembling. Then she slid into the kitchen and called the police. As she dialed, she could hear whoever this was circling the house. But, now this is crazy, not like a human. No, it was scampering, then stopping, and then scampering again. The sound moved fast, impossibly fast, as if whoever, or I guess whatever this was that was out there, was testing the boundaries of her home. When the officers arrived, which felt like forever, Diane ran and opened the door. They searched the yard, checked the windows, walked the perimeter with their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But once again, just like when her husband had done it, they found nothing. The night had swallowed any trace that anyone had even ever been there. Well, Keith arrived home while the officers were still there. He saw the cop car, he saw his wife, pale and shaking, and he realized that this was something he could no longer dismiss. Yet still, without tracks, without evidence, he had no idea what to think. While the officers left, the house settled back into its uneasy quietness. But then, something happened. Things changed. They seemed to get better. Months passed, actually. Winter deepened, and the snow blanketed everything. And then Diane stopped seeing eyes in the window. She stopped hearing scampering all around the house, and eventually she dared to believe that things just might be returning to normal. Oh, but that feeling of normalcy, that peaceful silence, was actually just the eye of the storm, the calm before the breaking point. On a cold December morning, just before sunrise, Keith slipped out of the house with a plan to get donuts as a surprise for his family. Well, he walked out, started the car, and then adjusted the rearview mirror, and that's when he seen them. Two enormous eyes staring back at him through the mirror's reflection. They were so large that they filled the frame. Well, Keith froze. These eyes didn't blink. Then the head lowered, revealing a silhouette that made him gasp. The face protruded out like a long snout on a dog. The person's head, or maybe we shouldn't call it a person at this point, was triangular, like an animal's head. But if this were an animal, well, then why did it have so much intelligence in its eyes? And why did it just keep staring at Keith? Well, Keith reacted instinctively. He threw the car into reverse, and it shot backward. Snow burst upward from the tires, obscuring everything behind him. When the cloud of powder finally settled, the figure was gone.
I just stopped, froze. At that point I knew, yes, there was something there.
Well, Keith raced back inside of the house. He grabbed his gun and unintentionally woke up Diane. Well, she saw his face, the disbelief, the fear, and finally, Keith understood what she had been trying to tell him.
Even though there was a morning hue, there was no way I was going to chase something that big in the dark. So I waited for daylight, and anyway, I had to listen to the wife say, "I told you so. I told you there's something out there." I said, "Okay, I seen it. I believe." So I had to get her to calm down, and then as soon as it got daylight, I called my friend Dennis. He said, "Yes, I'll be there. I've got to see this."
When Dennis arrived and he saw the tracks, he simply said, "Whatever this is, it's big."
The tracks were long, maybe 14 inches, and the heel was very narrow. It was almost like a human print, but there was something in the front, some kind of nail. I don't know what you'd call it. It was definitely not a dog paw. It was more like a human's print.
Right about now, I suspect that you may be thinking that this is just some typical dogman story, and many people have covered this account simply as a dogman story. But the finest storytellers of our time, like the great Mr. Ballin, have been very careful to steer clear of labeling this as a dogman story, and I am not entirely convinced at all that it actually even qualifies as one, and I think that you'll see why here in just a bit. Well, the two men lost sight of the tracks for just a moment, but then Keith spotted them up on the roof, and they kept going toward the backyard. It must have been like, a leap of 10 feet or so? Well, they ran around to the back of the house, and they saw that the tracks continued out into the yard. But get this, they did so at a good 20 feet from the house.
Whatever jumped off the back of my house landed 20 feet out in the middle of my yard. Nothing human or animal jumps like that. I was shaking.
Together, guns in hand, the two men followed the tracks into the woods behind the house. As they walked, they noticed that it was silent. Too silent. One would expect to hear birds in the morning, right? Nope, not a chirp. Birds weren't even stirring in the branches. Well, the forest was dense, and there was this light snow falling, but the tracks were clear, unmistakable, and easy to follow, and they did draw the men deeper into the forest. And even though these were two seasoned outdoorsmen, still, they couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of their necks rise with every step that they took.
At that moment, we expected the brush to explode and something there to confront us, but we never caught up with it.
The tracks moved forward with purpose, never hesitating, never circling back. And then the woods opened up into this small clearing. And at the end of the clearing, there stood something bizarre, something that just did not belong in the woods. Strange. It was a cabin, obviously the home of a recluse. But now, check this out. These tracks, they led straight to the door and then stopped. So, what then? Someone let it in? Or, I know it's crazy, I guess, somehow it opened the door and let itself in? Well, either way, this creature, or whatever it was now inside the cabin. The cabin was strange. It had weathered wood and a sagging porch, rusted metal roof. It looked abandoned, yet somehow, simultaneously, it also looked inhabited. Well, the two men approached the cabin with caution and confusion, and Dennis walked up and he knocked on the door. There was no answer. He looked down at the tracks. This thing had definitely went inside. Someone was in there with it, or it was in there alone. Either way, he wanted answers. So he began to pound and shout for whoever was inside to come out. But there was no answer, just silence. So they circled the cabin. Every window was caked with dirt. It was impossible to see through. The tracks led in, but no tracks led out. Yet there was absolutely no sound coming from this cabin. If an animal was in there, it would make a noise, right? Something, especially if you're pounding on the doors. Well, not knowing what else to do, they backed away, found a road, and then they followed it to a nearby phone booth. Keith called his father for a lift, and when he arrived, he listened to their story. And then he said something that made both men pause.
I know who lives there. That's old man George's place.
George? Who was George? Keith didn't know it yet, but George would be tied to this mystery in a way that he never could have imagined.
He's a hermit. He stays to himself. I've seen him a few times walking on the railroad tracks. Never on the road, never in town.
Keith's father said that he was a tall, thin man, well over 6 foot, and when he walked, he did so with this strange gait and this distant stare in his eyes. He never spoke to anyone, and he was never seen carrying anything, like groceries or other basic needs. No one even knew if his name truly was George. He just existed, like a shadow drifting through the outskirts of the community. Well, this, of course, didn't explain what Keith had seen at his home, but it did create a new question. Who was George? Well, over the next several weeks, Keith and Dennis dug into this, and eventually they discovered that this George just might not have been as much of a recluse as they had thought. That's because occasionally he helped out at a small tire shop in town, but still, it was odd. He was only paid in cash, he never spoke more than just a few mumbled words, and he always seemed to leave people with this uneasy chill. While the men devised a plan, Dennis brought in this tire that needed repairing, and the men stayed outside of the shop watching. Finally, George stepped into view, and when he did, it was unsettling. Keith hadn't yet seen him. The man indeed was tall, probably 6.5 feet or more, and he was thin, but strangely, he was muscular. And his face, it had this weird shape to it. It was elongated, narrow, coming almost to a point, and his eyes were large, reflective, and oddly silver. And when the light caught them at just the right angle, well, Keith said that he felt himself mesmerized by them. And that is odd, isn't it? Well, for a moment, he had this erroneous thought that this guy wasn't human. Well, George fixed the tire, rolled it outside, and then for just a moment, he stared at the two men with some type of knowingness in his eyes. Chilling, right? Then he turned and he walked back into the shadows without a word. Later, now this too is odd, Dennis discovered strange markings on the wall of the tire, symbols that he had never seen before. As his sister-in-law copied them down, and she took them to a professor who said that they resembled Nordic runes, but they weren't really consistent. Regional, perhaps. Hard to classify. Keith just couldn't stop thinking about it. Runes, they have a magical element to them, right? Were the markings a message? A warning? A ritual? Were the two men now cursed? Or was it nothing at all? Meanwhile, Diane remained uneasy at home. She didn't know about the cabin yet, not fully. She didn't know about George either, not beyond the little bit that Keith would share with her in order to keep her calm. But the sensation of being watched returned intermittently. That night, she double-checked the doors. She still avoided the windows, and she tried to keep life normal for Raven. But something about the land felt different. Charged somehow, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. And a new mystery began. It started with a discovery on the railroad tracks. An elderly man was found dead. No identification, and locals just assumed that it was Old Man George. But no one knew for sure. There were no official records for George. No family, no employment history. When he worked at the shop, well, he just called himself George. Basically worked anonymously for those that he served. Whoever he was gone. And with him, perhaps, answers that would never surface. But the story wasn't over yet. No, not by a long shot. Actually, the most perplexing parts of this story haven't even been revealed yet. You're thinking, what? I know, right? I was thinking the exact same thing when Amy was showing this to me. Well, this is because after this man's death, authorities investigated that old cabin, and then Keith saw inside of it, and what he found changed everything that he thought he knew about the creature and about George. When Keith first entered the cabin, he saw what appeared to be just the simple dwellings of an old hermit. A table, a chair, a small sink, a partially carved walking staff. Then on the table, he noticed, and this is extremely interesting, something I think you're going to want to remember for later, there was this jar of silver coins, silver dollars to be exact. And they looked oddly out of place in this old cabin, as if somehow they held way too much value for where they were. Well, Keith soaked it all in, and then he walked it down the hall to something else that seemed out of place. A door, one that most certainly did not belong in this dilapidated old cabin.
Part of the door was wooden, but it was made with a steel plate, and it was fastened together with rivets.
It was a strange door, indeed, for this old cabin, but it's what they found behind that door that actually makes this story the most puzzling.
Inside, there was a steel-plated room, 2 links of chain hanging from the wall. Now, this wasn't just small chain. These were log chains, and they were on a round clevis mount, and they were attached to the wall by rivets, and probably about 8 to 10 feet long each, 2 sections of chain.
Both the wall and the ceiling were covered in these deep scratches, and the scratches, well, they were far too high up, and they were far too forceful to have been made by any human.
As you walked into the room from the doorway, there was a barrier wall there, and as you get inside the room went backwards probably about 5 feet to a wall, and that's where the chains were hanging. That's where all the scratches were, and the room had no windows, none. It looked like a containment room of some kind.
After this, there were no further sightings at the Williams' home. No eyes looking in the windows, no scampering around the house, no heavy impacts on the siding. It all stopped, as if whatever had been visiting them moved on, or perhaps somehow left with Old Man George to, I guess, the next world. As I mentioned earlier, many people share this case as a dogman or werewolf story. But Keith never called it a dogman, and he never used the word werewolf either. As a matter of fact, he said that it looked much older. He said that it looked like the jackal-headed god Anubis, straight out of the history books from ancient Egypt. I don't know. Perhaps there are other ideas that we should consider about this case. So, what exactly terrorized the Williams' home? And why did an old man's cabin have what amounted to be a prison cell inside, complete with shackles, made for a giant? Well, the skeptics, of course, would say that there's a logical explanation for everything, and if one doesn't find it, he or she just isn't looking hard enough. And I suppose that for the most part, that's probably true. But if we were to dive into the craziness and consider the possibilities that lie at the fringes of our imaginations, then what are some of the things that we might pull from this mystery? Well, there's George. This is a man that no one knew. No records, no past, as if he had just plopped in from another world. Just an outsider moving along railroad tracks, the proverbial liminal boundary between places. Then there's the creature, appearing suddenly, watching, leaving tracks that led right back to George's cabin. Perhaps this story really is only about those two, and the Williams family simply moved too close. You know, cultures all over the world and all through time have described beings who sit as guardians of thresholds, watchers at the boundaries of life and death, symbols of judgment, psychopomps. Egypt depicted these beings as jackal-headed deities. Keith's description of this creature matches these archetypes eerily well. A canine man who watches, something that appears at thresholds, windows, rooftops, doorways, railroad tracks, the death of an old man. Maybe this creature and the old man weren't at all what and who the storytellers have thought that they were and made them out to be. Maybe, as Keith described, this creature was indeed from ancient times, the ancient god Anubis somehow in some form. And if so, well, then might there be another cosmic being who would possibly be intertwined with Anubis, one who is depicted as an old man from the ancient world? Well, if you know the reference that I'm hinting at, then mum is the word. Keep quiet. Don't tell whoever's with you. And like last week, we'll play a little trivia game. Lock what you think it is into your head, or better yet, write it down. And in just about 50 seconds from now, Amy will come on and she'll share this possible connection between Anubis and the old man. And I think that you're going to find it extremely fascinating. When she does, if you knew the answer, comment and let me know. Perhaps with some of these mysteries, we really need to start thinking just a little bit further than previous generations did. And maybe we should make that the hidden lesson for this mystery. Maybe the creatures in many of these sort of cases aren't at all what and who we thought that they were. Perhaps, if we hope to start making any sense of this strange world that we live in, we may have to start reaching beyond werewolves and folklore and into something much deeper, something further outside of the box than the answers that we used for yesterday's mysteries.
I'm going to guess that many of you already know that Anubis is an ancient Egyptian deity who's known for protecting the dead and guiding souls through the afterlife. Well, he's often depicted as a jackal-headed being. But have you ever heard of Charon? He comes to us from ancient Greece. He's the ferryman of the dead, entrusted with transporting souls across the rivers Acheron and Styx to the underworld. Now, as Damon would say, check this out. He's depicted as an old man, nameless to the people he ferries. He exists outside of normal society, not unlike a hermit, and he's paid in, are you ready? Coins. Many say silver coins. And he's known for having a long staff to guide his boat. The synchronicities are really eerie. Speaking of Charon as a hermit makes me think of David Stone. He disappeared, like a hermit might, into the New Mexico desert on Halloween night in 1988. And he left behind some strange artifacts, making people speculate as to what really happened to him. We've done a complete mystery on him, and if you'd like to see it, it's here.